Speaking of external oversights, how about the NGO and the civil society? How do they play their role in terms of keeping a check on the defense budget?
I think they play an important role in 2 or 3 ways. The first one is, for so long as the data is published, you do allow external groups to be able to comment and have opinions. And those opinions are often quite useful because they just give a different perspective on the value for money of what's being purchased. And so, for example, in the US, you'll find who is very good about publishing data on defense for all its problems. Actually, there's a very noisy debate about the quality or otherwise of particular big procurements, which I think adds to the value for money of the overall purchasing that the US does. In a number of countries, the Defense Ministry has actually invited NGOs in, for example, to help them in developing or affirming defense policy, for example. A good example of this was South Africa. After the end of apartheid, they brought in the NGOs to work with the new government on what should their defense policy be and what should their main items of spending be. And a number of other countries are picking up and following this idea, which I think is a really positive one.
But you did mention that for this to be possible, of course, information must be made public. But with regards to Malaysia, a lot of information is not made public, and on top of that, you did mention about the need for a committee and so forth, but there's very little political will to actually form such thing. So without the structure and information, how then can our representatives play their role to keep check on the defense budget in spite of a tendency by the government to keep status quo?
I think there's a push and a pull answer to your question. I think the pull answer is, it's my experience that defense ministries and armed forces actually, what's the right word, thinking constructively about corruption risk actually is often not sort of high on the practical to-do list of the agenda of the ministry. Not for any particular corruption reasons, but just because it has historically not been discussed. It's driven by the finance ministry or something like that. And I would say in the 20 or 30 countries that we've engaged with, pretty well all of them, actually when they think about this issue, say, actually there's a lot that we can do. The senior military, they hate using equipment that doesn't work, or that costs twice as much as it should do, or that it means their soldiers have equipment that's unsafe. So actually, even though the public mythology is quite often hostile to defense, actually there are often loud voices inside the system for saying, we ought to be better at this. So I think that's the pull side of the equation. We've seen significant governments, I mean Poland is a good example, a big nation, sizable military, who've done exactly this process, I think to their big credit. We've seen Norway do something similar. You might think, well, they don't have a problem, do they? Well, yes, they do, because all governments have this problem. And they have actively taken steps to really try to address this, even though people thought, well, they won't have the political will they? So I think that's the pull side, and I would really encourage the Defence Ministry here to be thinking about this, because actually I think there are many practical measures they can take. It's not that hard a problem to solve, because it's one that the solutions are known, if you like. On the push side, I would really encourage your MPs to ask more questions on this subject, because I do think detail about defence spending is important. I think it's important for 2 reasons. One is value for money, but the second is the more national reason, which is armed forces exist only if they have the public trust of the people. As soon as they don't, actually the confidence in the military and the defense ministry as a force for good vanishes. An example was Colombia during its time of its drug wars, where actually the defense ministry allowed itself to be seen as somehow engaged with the insurgents and highly corrupt. And it meant the public completely lost faith that the military could be a force for change. And I think that's the really fundamental reason why you'd expect MPs to ask questions and want to see this subject more openly discussed, because actually it matters for the trust and the faith in the armed forces.
Speaking of top military leaders, of course, you say they hate getting bad or equipments that are not working. But in Malaysia, we do have a practice where generals and top military leaders, after they have retired, they are appointed to military companies as directors and so forth. And so, does this sort of create vested interest or conflict of interest, because perhaps the companies would say, well, while they are in power, buy our products, and when we sell, when they are retired, they get to be the directors of those companies. So how does that then sort of affect the argument that you have given just now?
It's an important part of it, for two or three reasons. The first is the obvious one, that if a senior military or defense official goes immediately into a private sector company, he's in possession of commercially sensitive information, and you would expect there to be a time lapse to, if you like, lose the commercial value of his or her knowledge, and you'll often find that to be it's either 1 year or 2 years in many administrations. But actually that's only part of the issue, because there's a second part of the issue, which is, are these military companies private, or are they actually themselves associated with the government? Again, I don't know the detail here in Malaysia.
Here we have both. Some companies, they are totally private, and some, I would say the major companies, they are actually, the government are actually shareholders of the companies.
Yeah. Well, that makes it a more significant issue, because then you're even closer to it being a completely internal arrangement. So you would both seek to see more scrutiny, and you would seek to see much more disclosure of those companies' accounts, so that actually it's much more public what is happening. There's a third issue here, which is that one of the principal ways of trying to ensure value for money is to ensure competition. It doesn't always work. You can have collusion, you can have rigged bids, but it's better than private agreement. And so the final question is, if indeed there is some kind of improper promise of somebody going from government to a military company to say, you know, we'll reward you for favours, if it's competitive, it's just that much harder to do, because they're competing against other companies. So the final question is, just what percentage of the acquisition budget is actually competitive as opposed to done by private negotiation? And in quite a few defence ministries still, the percentage that is done by private negotiation is rather high.
Yes, this is what happened here as well.
I don't know the percentage for your country here, but it's usually a lot higher than it should be. And sometimes, occasionally, that's because there is only one supplier in the world for a product. But it's not often that that's the reason. Often it's just historical practice and sometimes corruption.